My combat journey began in the first days of March when the heavy IS-2 tanks first entered real combat. In that debut battle, my IS-2s, without suffering any losses, were able to destroy more than a dozen German PZ, KPFW, IVs in April. Near Ternopil, there was also the first encounter with Tigers, which also ended very successfully for me. The appearance of these new Soviet heavy tanks on the front was an extremely unpleasant surprise for the Panzerwaffe. It became quite obvious that the era of qualitative technical superiority, which they had achieved in 1943 thanks to the appearance of Tigers and Panthers, was coming to its logical end. The Red Army now had a combat vehicle capable of confronting the German heavyweights on equal terms and defeating them in open combat. About 5 years ago, a very interesting article was published in the popular German newspaper Die Welt, which is famous for its in-depth analytical articles. Journalists conducted a detailed comparison of the Soviet IS-2 tank with its German counterparts. This is exactly what this video will be about, where we will analyze their conclusions in detail. What exactly were the conclusions they came to in their article? In their general opinion, if we consider the totality of technical characteristics and combat capabilities, only the Panther and the King Tiger could be placed on par with the IS-2. At the same time, they noted that the Panther surpassed the IS-2 in only one aspect, mobility, but had weaker armor and less powerful armament, while the King Tiger, although it surpassed my tank in terms of protection and firepower, turned out to be heavier, less maneuverable, and significantly slower. The final conclusion made by the journalists was very flattering for the IS-2. The IS-2, despite some shortcomings, became a truly formidable weapon, inspiring terror, especially in the period from autumn 1944 to spring 1945, during the final assault on the territory of Germany. They summarized their research in the article. And what did the Nazis themselves think? Certainly, the opinion of modern journalists deserves some attention, but it is much more interesting and valuable to find out what the Wehrmacht tankers who directly encountered it in real combat said about this tank. Did it really inspire such terror in them just by its appearance? Or did the journalists, as often happens, embellish and exaggerate reality a little? Panzerwaffe General Otto von Manschufel, a Knight's Cross recipient with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, gave the IS-2 tank an extremely high rating, calling it without any doubt the best tank of that time in the world. Among the main advantages of the tank, he highlighted a very successful combination of a powerful 122mm gun with reliable armor and a low silhouette, not forgetting to mention its speed and maneuverability, which were no worse, and in some situations even better, than most German tanks. He first encountered the IS-2 in the spring of 1944 in Romania. His tank division, called Großdeutschland, held defensive positions near Iași. About 500 tanks from both sides took part in that large-scale tank battle, making it one of the largest on the Eastern Front. We were extremely surprised to find that our Tigers, although they fired at Soviet tanks from a distance of 2 kilometers and achieved several direct hits, could not penetrate their armor with their 88mm guns until the distance between us was halved. We had to counter the technical superiority of the Russians with our mobility, maneuver, and skillful use of terrain. He described his first encounter with the IS-2. Unlike Manschufel, the Nazi tank ace Otto Carius considered his own beloved Tiger to be the best tank in the world. In July 1944, he commanded a whole company of Tigers as part of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion, which was transferred to the territory of Latvia. He shared his detailed impressions of the first acquaintance with the IS-2 tank in his memoirs, published in the book Tigers in the Mud. I ask you to subscribe to my channel and like this video so that you can hear more interesting and exciting stories about the Second World War and the opinions of all sides involved in those events. The Joseph Stalin tank, with which we first became closely acquainted in 1944, was at least on par with our Tiger. It was significantly superior to us in terms of shape and silhouette, as was the T-34. We had not seen this machine on the northern section of the front before, which made us involuntarily shudder. because the tank was equipped with a very long 122mm gun. This was the first Russian tank gun with a muzzle brake. In addition, the Joseph Stalin tank somewhat resembled our King Tiger in its outlines, Carius recalled. By the way, it is interesting to note that there are relatively few reports from German tankers about the IS-2, significantly fewer than, for example, about the T-34. This is most likely due to the fact that it appeared at the very end of the war and was produced in much smaller quantities. And after a direct encounter with this tank, not everyone had a chance to write their own memoirs. Of all the surviving testimonies, the report of another company commander of Tigers is the most interesting, who summarized his own combat experience with IS-2 tanks. It is noteworthy that the Inspector General of Armored Forces, Heinz Guderian, left his personal notes on this report, which allow us to form a more complete picture of his assessment of the Soviet tank. The Panzerwaffe officer wrote in his report that, as a rule, upon seeing an IS-2, Tigers preferred to retreat without engaging in an open tank duel. They only engaged in firefights from a long distance, more than 2 kilometers, or from a convenient combat position, on the outskirts of a village, on the edge of a forest, or behind natural cover. In a frontal attack, the Tiger could penetrate the IS-2's armor from a distance of about 500 meters, but the IS-2 could also be hit from much longer distances without directly penetrating the armor. In addition, it was noted that the IS-2 crews often left their vehicle after the first hit from a Tiger shell. The most effective way to defeat an IS-2 was a mass shelling from its sides or rear. And in a frontal attack, after the first hit of an armor-piercing shell, it was necessary to immediately hit it with a high-explosive shell to blind the enemy gunner and disorient the crew. One of the main conclusions of this report was that a tank duel with an IS-2 should only be entered if at least a platoon of Tigers was in the ranks, since in a single duel, the Tiger was practically inevitably destroyed. What exactly were the notes that Guderian himself made on this report? First of all, he noted that this report was fully trustworthy, as its content completely corresponded to the reports received from other units. He also suggested that, most likely, the IS-2 could be penetrated in the side and rear not only by Tigers and Panthers, but even by 4s and Stu-GS. He generally supported the recommended ratio of forces in duels, at least 1 platoon of Tigers per IS-2, but clarified that 3 Tigers should not retreat, even if they encounter 5 IS-2, since it was not always possible to assemble the required number of Tigers. And the outcome of any battle depended not only on numerical superiority, but also on the level of training of the crews and the chosen tactics. But perhaps the most important and telling note should be considered the following. Tigers can no longer and should not ignore the tactical combat techniques that were developed for other types of tanks. Like all other tanks, the Tigers no longer have the right to advance to higher ground to reconnoiter the terrain. Formulations such as thick-skinned, invulnerable, and safe, which are often used by the crews of the Tigers and which, with their light hand, have come into use in other tank units, must be immediately eliminated from use. Instead, the crews of the Tigers need to pay the closest attention to compliance with the basic combat rules that apply to tank duels. Of course, it would be extremely interesting to hear a personal assessment of the IS-2 from those German tankers who actually had to fight it. However, cases of capturing this tank, and even in working order, were extremely rare, and there is no reliable information about the combat use of trophy IS-2s by the Wehrmacht. Nevertheless, there is a rather interesting story of a German tanker from the 16th Panzer Division named Martin Horst. Martin himself died quite a long time ago, when Wehrmacht veterans were not very fond of sharing their exploits in this war, so this case became known to the general public only through his grandson Michael. The essence of this legend is that in January 1945 in southern Poland, during one of the defensive battles, Horst's crew lost their Panther. However, after the battle, Soviet tanks retreated to their starting positions. They discovered an abandoned IS-2 in fully working condition. It was on it that they repelled the next attack of Soviet troops. They even managed to knock out several T-34s, but when the fire of about 10 tanks was concentrated on them, They were forced to retreat and hastily abandon their new vehicle. The credibility of this battle is doubtful, as no documentary evidence of this story has been found. But judging by the detailed description of the IS-2, we can say with certainty that Martin did see this tank with his own eyes. He noted that the Panther was much more spacious than the IS-2. The driver mechanic had a very narrow field of view. He was greatly impressed by the gun, which was more powerful than that of the Panther and comparable in its firepower to the 88mm gun of the King Tiger. He noted the comfortable place of the gunner, as well as the fact that the turret rotation and gun aiming were carried out using electric drives, supplemented by a manual drive for more accurate fine-tuning. The separate loading made a negative impression, which reduced the overall rate of fire of the tank. And of course, he was amazed by the tank's protection. When they got out, it turned out that the turret had withstood more than a dozen direct hits. The overall impression of the tank was definitely positive. In conclusion, we can say with certainty that according to the reports of German tankers, the Nazis, contrary to the claim of the newspaper Die Welt, did not experience any particular panic and fear of the IS-2. Nevertheless, they considered it an extremely formidable and dangerous enemy, which put a fat cross on the technical superiority of German tanks. Goodbye. I was very glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to leave comments under this video, like it, and be sure to subscribe to my channel.